onto this computer. Is there a little recording button come up?
Yeah, it says it's being recorded. That's
okay.
fine.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm responsible for it now.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, good. So what do they mean by natural capital? Well, I said it was the things that nature provides for free. And this is our forests and rivers. It's a natural environment, really. And what that then gives us is what they term ecosystem services. So they come from that natural capital, that asset. And some of those things are available to all: clean water, the ability to go to places and enjoy that nature, benefit all of us. But some of those things benefit us as landowners, and people producing food or fisheries, by underpinning, you know, the productivity of the land itself. So it's the whole gamut, really. Everything on that picture is included as the services for natural capital. But just to break it down a bit further and make it perhaps a bit more understandable, when they talk about natural capital, they're talking about the underpinning, the assets, or stocks, as this diagram calls it. So to preserve that natural capital, you're looking at maintaining your assets, and then from those assets flow the services that we enjoy, things like water filtration, the production of biomass, protection from erosion, pollination. All those services come from the natural capital itself, and then they provide us with lots of benefits: our food, the energy that we need, the clean water and air that we need, and less perhaps tangible things like just contact with nature, and the climate, you know, that we hope to continue enjoying, our sort of reliable British climate. And those goods can be termed as public or private goods. So if there's anything that can be commodified or bought or sold, it's private goods. Public goods are things which are available to all, and if somebody uses some of that public good, it doesn't affect other people's ability. So think about, you know, the provision of street lighting in a town. If somebody, you know, benefits from that street lighting, it doesn't prevent anyone else from benefiting. It's freely available, and that's a public good. And the environment plan, after much deliberation, I think, and a lot of debate, and that debate still seems to rage a little bit, but they have managed to pin it down to 6 public goods. And there they are: clean air, the clean and plentiful water, plants and wildlife, or perhaps what we call biodiversity in the Wildlife Trust, and then protection from the harm from environmental hazards, and they particularly pull out flooding and drought, making better use of resources from nature. And one of the things they talk to there is about greater productivity from the resource, so that you can sort of work out what you're producing from your resources, and of course our enjoyment of our environment, the beauty and heritage, and the ability to access it. So I'm just going to look a bit more closely at some of those public goods. But first I want to just touch on this one, because this always comes up as a question, and it is still debated. Is food a public good? Why was that not included on that list? And I think the reason it isn't, because yes, food it's a service that natural capital delivers to us. The land gives us the ability to grow food, and of course that's vitally important, probably one of the most important things alongside water and air to breathe that we have. But because food is a commodity, food is owned, it's bought and sold, and it therefore doesn't count as a public good itself. What they're trying to capture there is the non-food elements of the landscape and of farms. And in the past, we have specifically supported food production. The early years of CAP did that, and it did lead to some problems at the time. There was the wine lakes and butter mountains, and also it drove you know, a real push for greater food production, and that did cause some environmental costs along the way, which we're now, you know, in the business of trying to resolve. That's not to say, though, that some of the things associated with growing food might be able to be supported, possibly through public funding or possibly through private funding. So things like public health, if we look at the quality of food and the way it's grown, the sustainability, the nutritional value of it, it may be that that can be supported. So things that promote public health could be supported, whereas say just sort of food commodities might not attract that support. But what does that actually look like out on the farm? Well, there's a typical scene. That is a farm now. This obviously isn't post elms. This is a current farm, probably in stewardship, looking at the 6 metre margin there around the field. But looking at it through the natural capital lens, it is already delivering lots and lots of benefits. The hedge itself is growing biomass, and it's sequestering carbon into the soil and into the timber which it consists of, supporting lots of biodiversity, of course, especially this hedge. It's well managed, but it's allowed to grow and provide nectar and fruit. The margin that the farmer has carefully planted there, that is supporting biodiversity of all kinds, especially pollinators with the nectar. And looking at the slope of the land there, there could be, if that was just one big arable field, there could be quite a substantial runoff from there, and you could be losing nitrates, phosphates and silt into the watercourse at the bottom of the hill. But the way the hedges and the margin run across the contour, along the contours there, they would be trapping water and helping water to infiltrate into the land. So when you start to look at this through the natural capital lens, you can draw up an awful lot of a list of benefits that are being derived from what is already on the farm. And then we can build on that and look to how we could improve those benefits. So for instance, the crop itself, if that farmer decided to use cover crops during the winter, for instance, and avoid bare soil, avoid having sort of ploughed open soil through the autumn and winter, that would enhance the public goods that field would be delivering. It would improve its ability to retain water, to filter water through the winter, to hang on to those nutrients rather than release them to the stream. And of course, that could also benefit the farmer by preserving fertility in the field that would be useful for the crop next year. Slightly different situation, but similar to a grassland field. Again, that grassland is going to be retaining and filtering water, allowing it to move into the groundwater, or at least move slowly down into the watercourse that is probably in the hedge there. And there's a generous margin there, which it preserves lots of wildlife. And we have carbon sequestration, etc., going on there. And again, that is something already being delivered, but there's scope for enhancement. If perhaps that was a herbal ley which was being mob grazed or pulse grazed, they say that does great things for carbon sequestration and soil health and so on. And it really is, both these examples, the thing that perhaps is most controllable through farming practice is that soil health. And that is just coming up and up the agenda. Although they didn't pick out soil health specifically as a public good, it's definitely embedded in there. The fifth one, I remember the name of it, the better use of using resources from nature more sustainably. That specifically talks about soil health. And there was even a talk of a fund being set aside to develop metrics to work out the type of soil health that we want on farms, and the ways of farmers enhancing that. So looking at soil as natural capital is going to be a useful thing going forward in terms of attracting funding, but also just looking at the resilience of the farm into the future. I'm going to pull out a few other examples. We all know that ponds are good for wildlife, particularly one like this, which is presumably, it looks like it's a rainwater fed pond. The water looks like it'd be very clean. That will be delivering enormously well for biodiversity. And they also think ponds sequester a lot of carbon for their size. into the silt and the gunge at the bottom of the pond. So that would be playing a good part there, delivering those services, natural capital. Different type of pond here. This one's perhaps a bit more functional. It's catching water before it runs off that field. And so it may be, biodiversity may be lower down the list for that pond, although it's certainly still there. But it's offering a lot more services of attenuating flood, reducing those flashes of flood down into the watercourse, helping the silts to drop out, and so that when that water does eventually find its way into the watercourses, it's a lot cleaner and purer, and there'll be some carbon sequestration as well. And of course, the sixth one, the access, heritage and recreation. Some farms will be delivering a lot of this. Other places are more obscure and people don't really go there, and it's not such a high on the agenda. But where there are opportunities, this is another one that certainly lends itself to landscape scale working. If you can look at your neighbouring farms all around, see where the access routes currently go, and look at opportunities to link up or improve the visitor experience if there are people coming to enjoy that landscape, and perhaps interpret to them what's going on the farm, give them some insight into what they're seeing. And those sorts of things should be supportable through ELMS into the future. And then taking further steps, this is not for everyone, but some farms will be looking at tipping the scales further towards the natural capital and the delivery of these public goods, the clean water, clean air, biodiversity, etc., but with still some food production there, albeit perhaps with slightly lower outputs. So agroforestry is an example of that, where food growing goes alongside quite kind of high biodiversity outputs, and going all the way into putting whole areas of the farm aside, or for some people this might be their whole land holding, going the whole way, moving away from food production and going right into ecological restoration, or as people are terming it these days, rewilding, putting back the natural processes and letting nature have free rein. And obviously that's going to score very highly on developing, enhancing natural capital, but at the expense, of course, of food production. Or you may be able to produce some food from there, and there may be other benefits from it, such as shooting or wildlife experiences and so on, camping, all those sorts of things. So I hope that's helped at least set the scene on what sort of things, how the government is looking at natural capital now, and how you might start to look at your farm through that sort of prism, and think about the natural capital that your farm already has, or what it might be able to give in the future. And I was going, it's a bit cheesy, but I was going to end with a quote from John Eveling, the chap who wrote the book about the trees. Apparently his motto was explore everything and keep the best, which I thought was pretty appropriate here. You know, look around, look at every possible aspect of this, but then try and prioritize, work out which ones are going to work on your farm, because every farm is going to be different. And I think Archie's going to explain that in a lot more detail for you now. So I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Are there any sort of questions or comments whilst Giles hands over to Archie? Certainly be time to ask things at the end, but just wanted to give a chance now if there was anything. Thanks, Giles. That was
thank you.
A good sort of summary, and I think leads nicely into what Archie's got for us now. Thank you.
Grand. I think I saw Jeremy Taylor
host, so
name coming up.
Green. Can you make me the host? So I can share the
sorry,
screen?
I've got to do that, haven't I? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just about to do that. I'll carry on doing the recording, shall I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Oh. So I'm just not quite sure where the host bit is now.
If you find participants and you
yeah.
click on my name and then more.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Good.
Make host. There we go.
Work.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
That's worked. Thanks.
Excellent. So I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Can you see a series of 6 pictures? And
Yeah.
wave at me if you can't. Excellent. So thank you, Alison and Giles, for inviting me in. I feel a little bit out of my depth because I'm from East Anglia, and I'm speaking to people from an area which has sort of people and some level of sophistication. So you'll have to excuse me if I come across a bit bumpkin. So what I'd like to cover, as Alison said, we've gone through the process of doing a natural capital appraisal on the estate. So I'd like to touch a little bit on, why we did that, how we did it, what support we had, what information we used, and then what we got out of the other end of that. And Alison, people have just joined.
Okay, can you let them in?
Yeah, I've let them in. So really, and then as Alison said, please do feel free to fire questions at me throughout, or we can wait to the end. I can't see the chat function at the moment, so if Alison, if you keep an eye on that, you might be able to shout at me if I'm missing something.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, hang on, somebody else is. I'm just making sure that we've got everybody in. Right, there we go. Okay, perfect. So I run the Spainshall estate. So it's my family farm, family estate. I'm the 10th generation of the Ruggles-Brice family or the Ruggles family, I should say, to own and manage the estate. So I start off from a position of wanting to understand what the very long-term impacts of some of my management changes are. We cover around 2,000 acres in northwest Essex, just on the border, almost on the border with both Cambridgeshire and Suffolk. So we're about as far north in Essex as you can get before you drop into a county where people might actually want to come. We are a predominantly arable operation, and at the moment, as it's set up, almost all of the arable land is let. So I'm not a day-to-day farmer. So if you have any sort of technical questions you might wish to, I can take them away, or you might wish to ask Giles or Alison. And that letting happens under a mixture of AHAs and FBTs. However, I do manage a couple of 100 acres of woodland in hand, some grass fields, around 50 acres of grass fields that are no longer suitable for arable, given the size of the machinery that's used. And then I run all the diversification on the estate. So we've got some of the standard things like holiday cottages, horse riding. We also produce wild venison. I noticed that Alison said that there's an opportunity to get involved in a deer management group. That's something that we did previously here, and we've continued to do on our own back once the deer management group unfortunately disintegrated. But I produce wild venison off the back of that. And we also got a campsite. Most recently, we have reintroduced beavers to the estate in a fenced enclosure as part of a natural flood management project. And that's really thanks to my background. Before I came back to run the estate, I was working for and working with a group of environmental charities called the Rivers Trusts, who are sort of river catchment land managers. And I had a career with them alongside running the estate for many years. It's worth saying that our turnover on the estate is around 50% reliant on farm rents. Given where we are at the moment, given the situation with BPS, and given the performance of last year's harvest, and the fact that I'm sitting here in October when we should be drilling, looking out the window at another 40 mil of rain, with no drills running around me at all, this is starting to look a little bit precarious for me. Given not least that most of my farming tenants rely on that BPS to pay me my rent. So I'm looking at this thinking there's a risk there to my business. So I've been interested in natural capital for quite some years, given my environmental background, and I also worked in the water industry a little bit before that. I understand the sort of concept of working across a landscape scale, particularly around things like water. But really, from an estate perspective, I wanted to understand how the agenda for natural capital and environmental goods really played out on my land. So the question I always had, that I'm sure a lot of people have when they hear about the kind of big, grand talk about natural capital, is really, well, what does that mean? You know, which bit of my field am I going to have to do what with? Which part of my farm am I going to have to manage differently? And if I do that, what are the upsides? So, you know, what's the financial rewards I can expect? What are the costs that might be incurred to do that? And then we start looking at things like ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And I want to understand, before I accept payment rates for ELMS, whether those are going to cover my costs and whether actually they reflect the wider societal value of the goods that I'm delivering. So really, if you think of this as a kind of market research exercise, that will probably put it in a slightly more useful box than your standard kind of just a survey for a survey's sake type approach. I'm also using the natural capital approach to refine our project ideas for the estate. So I've got a number of things that I want to do, and to be able to articulate the benefits of those using the language that both the policymakers understand and the people that might actually wish to buy them, like your private buyers, your corporates, whoever, is going to be very useful, and it already is proving quite useful to me. And then there's a sort of cold hard asset security element to this. Is if I understand what the condition of my underlying assets are, what soil, you know, what is my soil quality, what is my woodland quality, etc., I can start to track whether that's improving, staying the same, or even at worst, degrading, and do something about that. You know, the vast majority of our asset, of our balance sheet in our financial accounts is made up of the value of the land on which we are lucky enough to work. Now, if I let that degrade and I pass this on to my children, I don't feel like I've done a terribly good job, but equally, they're going to have less earning capacity than I have. And that's not a terribly sustainable way of looking at it. I've also used the natural capital approach to try and get a handle on some of these impacts from the projects we've already done. So trying again to sort of bring them into a language that allows me to show an impact and show a positive benefit. And if you can show a positive benefit, then people are more likely to come on board and support your future ideas. So really, this is quite a long-term approach, but it's already yielding some quite short-term benefits to me. But really, it can be summed up of, if you're starting out on the natural capital approach, is how much have I got? How good is it? What conditions is it in? Where is it? And that's really important to me, because it's all very well having a broad brush appraisal done by somebody like Natural England saying, you know, the whole of the east of England is good for producing food. But I want to know exactly which bits are best for producing food, which bits can we do other things with, and then really who benefits. So until I understand all of those top three things, I can't start going and knocking on people's doors and saying, listen, come on, I've got something you want to buy. So similar to what Giles did earlier, here's a view over our farm. The blue line down the middle is a little river we have. We're right at the top end of a river catchment, so we don't have a huge amount of water, and we're in East Anglia, so we have less than 600 mil of rain every year. But you can see we've got a fairly common patchwork of land. So this is how it looks today. So you've got the arable areas where we're currently paid to produce food and fibre. The farmers derive the commodity income from that, and I derive a rental income from them. But there is also a potential pollution liability, because we're not an organic farm and we're not a low inputs farm. So therefore, the things we put on run the risk of disappearing somewhere else. And with the advent of the growth of the polluter pays agenda, we may actually find ourselves being hit with a bill to clean some of that up. You look at some of the hedgerows on there. You know, we previously, we're not currently, but previously we've managed some of those hedgerows under ELS. So, you know, we got a bit of income from that, but really that's it. As it stands at the moment, I get no income from those hedgerows whatsoever. So, you know, they are a management cost to me, and they're no financial benefit. They're lovely to see. We have a very, very small wild bird pheasant shoot on the estate, and they're great for that, from that perspective. But really, you know, we're deriving all of the pleasure and benefit from that, where we could perhaps be doing something else. You look at the new timber plantation that we've got in there, or new woodland plantation. All the woodlands on our estate are either ancient semi-natural woodlands, or they're broadleaf native woodlands. So we've got no really fast-growing conifer plantations or timber production on the estate. So once the grants to plant them expire, which they have done on the one you can see in the middle, or they are so ancient that the only income we can really derive over the top of them is countryside stewardship. So we've got higher tier stewardship on all of our woodlands, and we sell the timber, we extract as much as we can. I'm lucky if they cover their costs of management. However, I know that there is a huge amount else that they can be doing. And you take the river itself, you know, water is the central theme of my career, really. And I look down at this river and think, really, as far as it is at the moment, the only thing that river is doing for me is costing me money. Because if I have to manage it or do anything with it, then that is a cost to me. Nobody's paying that cost, and we choose not to manage our rivers and let them kind of manage themselves. But you know, as it stands at the moment, I'm not getting any benefit from anything else I'm doing. Once we take a kind of natural capital approach, you can start to see that there are potentially a lot more things that I could start to monetize, but I've got to understand the scale of what the provision is. So, you know, each of these areas, as Giles much more eloquently put, you know, things like grassland, you can retain soil, you can retain nutrients, you can provide habitat. If you're in the right area, then people might well pay you to access them. The arable land, you can still produce food. And it is worth saying that, you know, food is an ecosystem service. Timber is an ecosystem service. They might not be public goods, but they are still ecosystem services. So they still come into a natural capital approach. And there's a lot of carbon sequestration we can do from managing both our timber, but also our land in the soil. And if you start to look at the thing that's running down the middle of the river, we can start to think about, you know, how much cleaner is the water that we release from the estate than the water we receive? Right? Is it cleaner, or are we actually sending it on its way dirtier than it was before? If we can prove that actually we're not, and that we're having a benefit, then perhaps there is a market there that we can tap into. I'm already in the market of flood reduction, so I've got grants to slow the water on my farm and stop it flowing into people's houses in the downstream village. It's not a perfect situation. It's certainly not an absolute solution to that problem. But, you know, we have a benefit, and we are starting to articulate that benefit to the people that matter. And in our part of the world, we also suffer from drought. So, you know, I might be sitting here with 40 mil of rain outside, but for the last 3 summers, we've had virtually no rain, and we've been in official drought conditions. However, some of our projects, and particularly the Beaver project, has been storing water and releasing it slowly during the summer. So there are other benefits there. And what the natural capital approach allows us to do is to articulate those benefits, so measure them, but also show them to people in a form that they have to accept, rather than us just turning around and saying, we think we're doing this, and everyone going, well, that's great, it's lovely, you know, show me the evidence. So we teamed up with a team from Atkins, the big consultancy, based not a million miles away from you, up in your neck of the woods, or a little bit further north in Oxford. The reason we teamed up with them was because we've been working with them on the Natural Flood Management Project, and they were very keen to help me on this. And the first thing we did, and it's a really, really important step, and particularly if you're entering into the world of natural capital appraisal for the first time, is sit down with the people that you think might be able to help you and thrash out exactly what your scope is. Agree the physical boundaries, agree the theoretical boundaries. You know, which ecosystem services do you think? So therefore, you know, you should sorry, someone is trying to come in again. Which ecosystem services do you think might be of interest to you? And also equally, what's not? Because you can get really tied up in trying to appraise things that really turn out to be of no interest at all. Once you've agreed what you're going to look at, you can then start collecting the information. And we collected a whole load of information on electronic maps, so GIS, to create the baseline. And the baseline is the really important bit, because it shows you what habitat areas have you got. You know, what is your land used for? How much of that land is used for each different purpose? Where is it? And from there, you can start to do some really interesting things. You can start to identify, you know, what are the benefits arising from those habitat areas? So an ecosystem service is simply a human benefit that arises from a natural asset. So from those habitat areas, there are benefits that arise to humans from those things. And you need to identify for each of those land areas, a bit like Giles and I have done on the pictures that we've shown, you need to actually identify which ones are doing what. And there will be different selections of ecosystem services for every single part of your farm. Once you've identified which ones you're looking at, you can then start to run some information or pull together some information that gives you an ability to work out how much benefit is arising from each of those habitat areas. And now you can start to see that rather than just having a series of pretty maps and then looking at sort of the flows that come off those maps, we're starting to then get to a point where we've got some really useful information to say, we know that more of this is coming from this area than that area. And once you've got that kind of information, you can then move on to ascribing those flows a value. So what is that worth? And I very purposefully leave this towards the end, because actually the first 4 steps that you do in this process are almost as important as then the pounds, shillings and pence you put on the end of it. Because as I will come to in a minute, the pounds, shillings and pence bit is quite subjective at this point. But the fact that you've quantified the ecosystem services flows are much less subjective. And those are the things you can really rely on. And then for us, the one thing that we did, which is different to most natural capital appraisals, is we went one step further. Because I had a series of project plans that I want to put into action on the estate, I was able to artificially change some of those habitat areas, change the baseline, and recalculate what the flows are coming from the new land uses for those parts of the estate, re-quantify them and revalue them in order to work out whether actually we're getting the most environmental benefit from those project areas, but also be able to demonstrate to people that if they support me in running these projects and helping these projects be delivered, there is a benefit there that potentially I can hand over to somebody else, and that becomes then a contract. So the sort of information we used to create the very first step of that, or the second step of that, the baseline, I've tried to split it out into 3 different areas. We used information that's publicly available, so things like maps of ancient woodlands, public rights of way, sewage discharges, designated areas, all these kind of things, river catchment boundaries. You know, these are sort of things that are almost inarguable. You know, they're things that are there that no one's going to argue really about. And then we looked at things like river condition. So we took the Water Framework Directive water body condition and said, well, you know, how good is the water that's coming off our estate based on whatever level of sampling there is, which to be fair isn't very much. And then we started to calculate some information as well. And I'll come back to how we did that in a minute. But then the really important thing to understand is that this relies on quite a lot of estate data. So it's information that only you and I will hold. So our ownership boundary, yes, people could get it from elsewhere, but you know, it's something easy for us to pick out and hand over to the appraisers. Tenancy boundaries in our cases, you know, who's doing what are their sort of, what are their land areas, you know, who has influence and control over which area. Field boundaries, again, you know, we could slightly take it for granted that we know that, you know, that field is high field and that field is home field, but actually nobody else knows that. And it's really important to understand that we need to get down to that kind of level to make this sort of process really useful. Otherwise, if it covers half of your farm or the whole of your farm in one kind of classification, it doesn't really give you any information to help you make management decisions. And so we spoke to the tenants and they were very kind and provided their cropping data. They also provided details of their stewardship schemes, those of them that are in stewardship. And then also I had to hand, or mainly anecdotally, things like flood records and observations. We've got a small group of volunteers that go across the estate and take wildlife sightings, sort of bird counts and things like that. So we try to incorporate as much of that as we can. And then from my perspective, I also threw in some fairly detailed project designs and some maps that we'd done in order to create that kind of extra scenario at the end. And we did have to purchase some data as well. So I'll come back to why we did that in a bit, particularly for the national tree map. But sometimes buying some information that somebody else has taken the time and effort to put together actually reveals something that you didn't already know. It certainly did for us. But that's not to say we had all the information that we wanted. We absolutely didn't. So, we would have got a better feel for the ecosystem service of food production if we'd actually used the field level yields and the gross margins, the actual achieved gross margins of those fields. But at this stage, as the landlord, I wasn't comfortable with going to the tenants and asking for that kind of information until I could prove that there was some viable reason why I would need it, because obviously that's their commercially sensitive information. More wildlife records would have been good. More information on the water quality would have been good. Information on how our water actually flows across the landscape would have been great. Same with groundwater. Air quality information would have been great. I mean, I don't know anybody who collects air quality information on their estate, but DEFRA do in a network of air quality stations across the country. Soil nutrients, a lot of our farmers do soil testing, but again, in the same way for the yields, I didn't go into that level of detail this time. Perhaps we could next time when we come back and rerun this in a few years' time. Things like soil organic matter and particularly soil carbon, we don't have that information. A lot of farmers are starting to do it, and we're possibly a bit behind the curve on that. But that is a really important piece of information for the future. And things like visitor numbers on footpaths. I mean, I don't know many people, unless the footpath runs right past your kitchen window, I'm not sure many people know how many people use them. We certainly don't. So what are the benefits that we identified from our land? And this is the full list of groupings of things that we put together. So food production, you can see, comes at the top. We did look at that. We did look at the gross margins on our crops, on our cropped areas, and work out what is the sort of an estimate of the food production value of that. And then there were things like water resources and groundwater, air quality, water quality and purification. So, how clean is the water? Flood risk, soil and erosion risk, carbon sequestration, pollination potential, and so on. And we tried to come up with a way of expressing each of those ecosystem services. So you can see, for example, that carbon sequestration, we looked at tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that was sequestered per year. Air quality, we looked at the gaseous emissions of nitrous oxide and ammonia that come out of our arable lands, and things like this. And this is where you start to understand the value of, or I certainly started to understand the value of getting some people that are actually rather expert in doing these things to do it, because you can take a lot of this information and get to a certain point. But I think the real value that we saw was getting some people that are a lot cleverer in a lot of these areas than I am to give us some information that then became much more useful. And then this is the last column here is just how we did that. So where it says value transfer approach is that we took data from somewhere else and applied it to our volume calculations in order to arrive at value. And then we also had some models, which I will go through in a minute, that allowed us to kind of model our farm based on research outputs. So a lot of this stuff wasn't measured, or in fact, virtually none of it was actual measurements. It was all modeled outcomes. And I think we have to be alive to the fact that that's most often the case. So, if you see someone's natural capital appraisal, it's probably based on modeled outcomes. For the vast amount of the land area in the UK, we don't measure a lot of this stuff. So therefore, you can't say, I know I've got X amount of tons of carbon, because it just doesn't get measured. So for biodiversity, and I've tried to pick out some of the ecosystem services that I think might be of interest to you. And I look at this unashamedly through a kind of commercial lens. So I'm looking at it thinking, well, which ones are most likely to yield a revenue stream for the estate? And biodiversity offsetting is one of them, potentially. So we looked, this is the biodiversity metric. So DEFRA and Natural England have developed this, or Natural England have developed it for DEFRA, and it is the process by which every development has to follow to calculate how much biodiversity they are losing as part of their development, how much they can offset on site, so how much habitat they can create, which will prevent that degradation, and then whether they need to look off-site for that. And we looked at the off-site bit because we're not looking at doing any developments, so therefore we're not really in the first part of it. we are looking to understand whether any of the project plans that we have can contribute to those extra units that can't be created within a development boundary. And so we took an approach where it's a series of really quite big spreadsheets, but they're very well designed and they're relatively easy if you know what you're doing, which I know more about now, but I can't profess to be an expert. You simply put in your habitat types. So this comes back to your baseline. So if you've got that baseline information, filling in a lot of these spreadsheets becomes quite easy, and certainly becomes much easier if you get somebody else to do it. And you run through the columns and you fill in the ones in white. You tell the spreadsheet whether you think your habitat condition is good, fairly good. In this case, it's, I picked cropland at the top, cereal crops. You don't get a condition score for that. It's just assumed to be agricultural. And then you have a connectivity score there, which they have another tool that you have to use to work out how connected your habitat is to designated areas and things like that, for example. And then you sort of keep working your way along the columns, and at the end of it, you end up with a number of biodiversity units, which is great. It means absolutely nothing until you float a potential value over the top of these biodiversity units. So for us, for example, it turned out that we ran this at a very kind of high level, and we reckoned we had over 300 biodiversity units potentially available to sell, or potentially available to have been created and therefore available to the market. And if you look at estimated values or forecast values for a biodiversity unit, you're looking for anywhere between £5,000 and £20,000 per unit. So suddenly that becomes something quite interesting and something worth looking at, if you're prepared to make that land use change. And we're talking 30-year plus contracts here, so not suitable for all areas, not suitable for all people, but just gives you an idea as to why this was quite interesting, perhaps in some areas. I said that we looked at and we were able to understand, what some of the risks were around our farm. And the main one, being an arable farm, is the export of nutrients, which then has a detrimental impact on the water environment, but also costs my farmers, and looking at things like soil erosion. And for this, the team at Atkins used another model called FarmScoper. And when I'm talking about a model, really all these things is cleverly designed spreadsheets. So if you've got somebody who knows what they're doing and how to assemble the information to be input into these spreadsheets, then it really does yield quite interesting results. This one was developed by ADAS originally for DEFRA, and I think has been used by catchment sensitive farming to calculate impacts. And you simply build your farm in numerical form. So you tell the spreadsheet, excuse me, you tell the spreadsheet what sort of farm you are, where you are, how much rainfall you've got, what is your farming operation, how many cows you've got, how many sheep you've got, how much cropped area you've got, what you crop in those areas, what your tillage regime is, all these sort of things. So it's quite laborious, but it isn't necessarily all that difficult to do. And out of that, you get a list of impacts. So, how much nitrate are you losing on a modelled basis? Bear in mind from your farm, phosphate, phosphorus, sediment, methane, but also, interestingly, some other things like soil carbon and the amount of carbon you're emitting from energy use at a certain level. But also, FarmScope is starting to look at things like biodiversity and soil quality and water use. So it's giving us another way of arriving at a figure for some of these ecosystem services that we're quite interested in understanding more about. So another one we used, which I found quite interesting, it was a tool called SciMap. And this one is designed to calculate how at risk of erosion your land area are. Now, being in Essex, most people assume that we have 0 hills and absolutely no topography whatsoever. So I'm going to show you a map, and it does have some contour lines on it. So you can see that, occasionally you do find a bit of up. And I can see people leaning into the screen, and yes, I admit there aren't an awful lot of contour lines on this, but they are there. And what happens when you run SciMap and you put it onto your mapping software is this. So you get a map over the top of it, which says the dark blue areas are the ones where you get most accumulation of rainfall, and they are most at risk of erosion. And this happened to be quite helpful for us, because if I drop a couple of red lines on here, these are two of our major project proposed areas. And one of my things that I'd like to try and achieve is to keep our soil on the land, but also keep the nutrients where we put them and prevent flooding. And so you can see that actually we're including land use change in a lot of areas where there is going to be a benefit. Now, that might be blindingly obvious if you stand on that hillside and say, you know, well, it's hilly. You know, there's quite clearly a place where the rain runs down the hill, collects, and it will go down the track and end up on the road. Brilliant. You know, it doesn't take a model to tell you that. You're absolutely right. But what this model does is it gives us an amount of water. It gives us, we can then feed that into the frequency of the rainfall events, and we can work with the guys at Atkins to come up with a figure. So if we prevented a proportion of that rainfall ending up on the road, or even better, ending up in someone's house, there is a value to that. So if you prevent a house from flooding, there is a nominal repair value of £30,000. So you used to think, well, suddenly you're saving somebody £30,000. There is a cost to you from implementing that project. If you express it in a natural capital way or an ecosystem service way, you can start knocking on the door of the local council or the local highways agency and say, listen, this is something we need to talk about because I'm willing to do this, and there is a value to you. There is a cost saving to you of me doing this. And this is exactly what we're doing. From a soil erosion perspective, we used the same tool. And what the guys at Atkins were very clever about is they actually took all of our woodlands away. So they looked at the maps and they said, okay, we're going to put 0 woodlands, completely artificial situation. And we'll run the tool on that. And then we'll drop all the woodlands back over the top of it and show that there is a benefit to having woodlands on the estate. Again, blindingly obvious, completely contrived situation, but it's very helpful. So that's the middle one. So we've got the left-hand one there, which is fully arable, no woodlands at all. We've lost all our 200 acres of wonderful woodlands. The middle one is actually how we are. So that's all the woodlands we've got. So that shows that having woodlands is better than having no woodlands. We save soil by doing that. And then on the last one, that's the scenario once all my projects have been delivered. So another artificial scenario showing again that there is a further benefit from that. So we will reduce soil erosion. And that has a benefit. So I'm now talking to the water company about, you know, how do we share that benefit? This is one that I won't go into any detail of. Suffice to say that you'll probably have had or heard about the conversations about, you know, where does phosphorus and nitrogen water pollution come from? And there's a lot of, you know, arguments in every catchment, you know, how much of it is sewage treatment, how much of it is septic tanks, how much of it's arable. What we were able to do through this process, because we had the support of the guys at Atkins, was rerun that, what they call source apportionment model, but just for the estate. So I now know, it's not a terribly surprising picture, but I now know that the vast majority of those nutrients are likely to be coming from our arable land. And to me, that flags up a bit of an issue because, you know, if those nutrients are coming off my land, then the chances are we're putting them on there in the first place. But also, you know, in terms of phosphorus, it's sediment bound. It's a sediment bound nutrient. So that means that we're also losing some of our soil. So you can see there's a bit of a compelling case, not only for me to try and sell some of the benefits to someone else, but actually to start looking again at how we manage our own land, which perhaps wouldn't be quite so obvious if we hadn't gone through this process. So we also looked at things like carbon sequestration, and we used a couple of tools to kind of compare to see whether we got different answers. But overall, from the land changes we were looking at, it showed that we could probably sequester around about 264 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. Now suddenly, if that's all done under the Woodland Carbon Code, and I register that as a project, that means I can definitely sell 264 carbon credits. So that's definitely, that is something I could definitely do. And I'm looking into that at the moment. We did look at below ground carbon as well. And we used a map, which interestingly was created by CEH. So it's great that Alison's having that conversation with CEH because they have this information. And what we showed from that is that if we changed our farming technique to something more akin to regenerative farming, which is one of the ideas we haven't done this yet, but one of the ideas we have on certain parts of the estate, we could sequester extra carbon in the soil. But interestingly, if you remember, we're looking at 264 tonnes a year for the new woodland that we're looking to create. From changing to regenerative agriculture on admittedly a smaller area, so about half the area we're talking about, we're looking at a forecast, conservatively forecast, that we're probably getting 4 tonnes a year below ground. So it immediately starts to make me think, okay, well, that's a good thing, perhaps, and we'll get yield benefits from that. But in terms of carbon credits being the driving force, perhaps that's not an appropriate thing to be majoring on. So it helps me understand, what's worth focusing on and what's not. As I said, we did a baseline versus a scenario. So we did, we took the information, and I think this is one of the things that I'm finding most useful about our natural capital appraisal is because we went that step further and were able to show a potential change, it gives people a feel for a direction of travel. And we did this very consciously because we wanted to articulate where the estate was going, where I want to take it, why I've got ambitious plans for certain parts of it. And this is really done as a marketing tool. So, we can show that if you support me in doing this, these are the benefits. So I am actively trying to generate that market that people talk about, rather than necessarily kind of waiting for the government to decide what it wants to do and what it's going to buy and how much it's going to pay. I'm really not patient enough to do that. I'm going to try and make this work in advance of that and pick that up when it arrives. So this is where the percentage change comes into it. You can see that we got a picture of, what are the big changes that we're going to see. So if you look at this from just a flows perspective, so there's no monetary value ascribed to this yet, you can see that the biggest potential gain from our projects is carbon sequestration. And then the next biggest is educational value, and the next, or educational provision, and the next one is health. Now, you can look at that and you go, right, okay, well, that's great. That's really interesting to understand, but there's actually not necessarily a huge amount of information. If you stopped there, I would probably be sitting here and going, well, do you know what? I'm going to hang soil and erosion risk. I'm going to hang pollination potential. I'm going to hang biodiversity because actually it's not terribly interesting. I'm just going to focus on the top 3, which are carbon, education, and health. However, if you start to turn your tonnes into pounds, so you take the values that other people have worked out somewhere else, you multiply them by the volumes you've got from your provision, you end up with a total pounds per year, and in our case per 25 years for the provision across the estate. It is worth flagging up at this point, until you actually sign a contract with someone, these are not market values. So they are environmentally, economically robust figures, and you're using exactly the same approach that developers will use to justify the amount of added economic activity they are getting from it, or they will bring from a development of houses, the number of extra jobs, the amount of extra wealth they're going to create. It's exactly the same process. All I'm doing is using this for environmental goods. But it's still not the same as going to Mr. Coca-Cola and saying, will you pay for this? At that point, you start entering a negotiation that we're all familiar with whenever you're trying to sell or buy or sell something. However, it is useful because this is the graph of the values that we came up with. And you can see that the only one that goes down is food production. And that stands to reason. If we're changing 94 hectares of our estate from producing food from arable fields to something else, the chances are we're going to be producing less food. And there is a trade-off with this thing. So anybody that tells you that you can produce the same amount of food and you can max out on environmental goods is either in the most wonderfully productive area, or they just haven't done their figures right. However, what this showed us is that there is a different rank if you ascribe monetary values to our ecosystem services. So in this case, we would be looking at air quality, carbon, and biodiversity. And this is entirely a function of how much our land can produce, and also the value that we have chosen to ascribe to each unit of that. So there are 2 things that you can actually change here. So you can manipulate this any which way you want, but equally you've got to be aware that from our perspective, we used kind of heavily researched values so that we could have some confidence that we were doing roughly the right thing. However, it still doesn't mean that there's any potential for me to sell any of these things. So you've got to think about which of those services are most likely to be marketable and when, and what timescale. So I was on a call this morning where we were talking about biodiversity net gain, and somebody on that call said that they didn't think that mandatory net gain for corporates rather than developments. So developments, it's most likely to come in 2023. For corporates, it's probably 5 years behind that. So you've got to think, you know, what is the timescale that I want to do something on my farm? Do I need cash now, or do I want to set up something for the future? And that will be specific to your own circumstances. So whilst a natural capital appraisal will give you some things, what it won't give you is an absolute roadmap to a future set of contracts, because it will be up to you as to which ones you pursue. You know, and you might be far more interested in trying to provide extra educational resources and support the youth coming through and get them to understand the environment. And that has a huge value. And there's no reason, just because the natural capital appraisal didn't focus on that, that you couldn't do that. This is where I come back to, you know, it's really important to understand what sort of things you would like to get out of a natural capital appraisal at the very beginning, and then to choose your team who deliver it for you correctly, so that you can get into the detail of that side of things. The other thing that we try to do is communicate the results of this, and it's really difficult. You know, I don't always have the luxury that Alison's offered me today of sitting here and talking for 45 minutes about this. So, you know, you have to come up with pretty pictures. So, you know, this is one that I put together based on the information we've got for our estate. And this is just a snapshot to say, you know, if we did all these projects, this is what we would get. This is a different approach put together by some friends of mine who run a company called Nature Capital. And they are taking a very different approach, because what they want to try and do is benchmark one land holding against another. And this is quite useful if you're trying to understand, well, you know, is you know, 264 tons of carbon in trees, is that a worthwhile amount? You know, it might be big for us, but actually, is it, in the grand scheme of things, is it worth bothering with? And so a benchmarking approach will give you that kind of insight to say, actually, you know, we are better than average on this, or we are worse than average on this, and maybe we need to think about how we can bring ourselves up if we want to enter some of these markets. You know, it might show your weaknesses. So there's a number of different ways you can express it, but also a number of different things that you can get out of an appraisal like that. The other thing that we got was some very great ideas about, you know, things that we should start to measure, but we don't have. So the number of footcraft users, soil carbon, water quality, more on sort of pollinators and invertebrates, and flood level area recording, for example, so that the next time we come back to do this, we've got better information than we did the first time. And I don't take that as a criticism, because we're all going to start with imperfect information. It is very expensive collecting a lot of this information. So you really want to be able to understand which information is most likely to be of value to whatever outcome you want to achieve. For me, it's trying to get into environmental markets, but for you, it might be something completely different. So you need to have that, try and understand and try and get your head around which bits are going to be of value. Some other things came out that were really important for me. I have a load of ideas fizzing around in my head all the time, and getting them, having the discipline of having to sit down and explain to a team of sort of half a dozen technical experts what that means in reality on the ground was a great piece of work for me to have to do. And it's really helped me then articulate that going forward. It revealed new things that we could measure on the estate. So I mentioned the National Tree Map, which was a data layer that we bought. And the reason we bought that was because I've never really been terribly happy with only looking at things that are classed as woodland on CEH's land cover map, because you don't get sort of infield trees, you don't get fields for the little copses that are dotted around the farm. And the other thing you don't get is area-based measurements for your hedges. So that wonderful hedge that Giles showed in the previous one would still have been, you know, a linear measurement. So it might be 200 meters of hedge, and that could be a hedge that's 1.5 meters high, 1.5 meters wide, trimmed every year. Or it could be the hedge that Giles showed you, which is, what, 4 meters high, probably 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 meters wide. So what we've got then is an area-based measurement for our hedges. So I can now tell you that we've got 26 hectares of hedges on the estate, whereas previously I could only tell you we had about 11 kilometres. So, you know, it's a different way of articulating these things, but also it has value going forward, because if we manage our hedges differently, it's very unlikely I'm going to change the length of them, particularly if there's no gapping up to do, or extending new hedges. But what I can influence is the width of them and the height of them. And we start to then do area-based measurements, or even better would be a volume-based measurement for a hedge. It revealed some risks, which I've touched on, so things like soil erosion, nutrient export, which I'm now going to be looking at and working with our farmers to try and understand whether there's anything we can do as landowners to help them. And it sort of highlighted some of the opportunities. But really, the main thing is that it helped me focus on those ecosystem services that either showed me that they were important or that they have potential market value. And that was, I think, probably the most important thing that came out of it for me. Alison asked me to try and give some thought really to, you know, what can you do? Because not everyone has, you know, an environmental background like I do, so I'm very lucky in that respect that I can speak a lot of the language anyway. But really, even if you don't have that, is engage with the concept. And you've already started that by logging onto a webinar tonight. And I'll give you, you know, one video and one document that I think are probably quite useful to have a look at. But also to accept and recognise that every single area of your farm is going to be producing a different range of environmental goods, but also in different volumes to the one next door to it. And that is, again, going to be different to your neighbour's farm, and it will be different this year to what it is next year. So we have to sort of reconcile ourselves to the fact that actually it's not going to be possible to say, you know, an arable field does this, and it does this in East Anglia, and it does this in, you know, at Christmas Common or in the Hampshire Downs or wherever it is that you happen to find yourself. And because of that, I would thoroughly recommend that you speak to specialists. So if you have land agents, talk to them. If you have trusted advisors from BBOWT or from the Wildlife Trust or whoever it might be, speak to them, because they will have a specialist understanding of some elements of this. But it's probably incumbent on you as the person that sits in the middle of this to pull it all together and make sense of it yourself. Because you're all in a collaborative group anyway, you're in a great position to work together to answer a lot of these questions for yourselves, and also take a procurement opportunity to some of these providers. So people like Nature Capital or Stratton Parker or Atkins or Savills or whoever it is you want to use. All of these people do those, and there are loads more of them as well. But as a group of farmers, you have significant buying power. So you need to go and use that to try and drive down the costs of doing this work. I was lucky that I got a grant to cover the cost of this work, but that's mainly because I'm a very persuasive person and I've made some very good friends at the Environment Agency. And the final thing to do is don't disregard any of the information you currently collect. So if you're sitting on your tractor and you've got yield mapping and you've got soil test data, you've got a team of volunteers who walk across your state once a year and collect some information on, you know, game birds or, you know, game bag data, whatever it is, just start collating it, start collecting it. Recognize the power that you have in your own information, because you are the only person that has that information. The government doesn't have it. They certainly don't have all of it. And you can then use that to leverage your position and enter into all of these contracts, but also check that you're not being so I said that there were a couple of things that I would recommend you do. One is a document called Enabling a Natural Capital Approach, which was put out by the government in March, just before lockdown. It's quite a long document, but it is one thing that it is something that you can kind of dip in and out of. So you can look at the headings and go, well, actually today I might look at, you know, how this might be valued or how you might measure it. I found it quite useful. And then on the Rivers Trust website, they put together a series of short animations, which kind of, you know, I found quite useful in sort of helping me understand, you know, what's an asset, what's an ecosystem service, why is this of benefit to me as a landowner, you know, which bits are public, which bits are private. So, you know, it will support a lot of what Giles said earlier. And finally, I will just finish on, I had a very quick look at your, or Alison very kindly shared me the sort of aims of the group, and I had a quick look across them and tried to understand, tried to give some idea as to why I think this might be of use to you. Given where you are, if you can start highlighting the tourism value, perhaps that's a benefit to some of the plans you may have for your land, but it also might help you highlight the value of the environment. If you need to steer people away from high environmental value areas, you can highlight the tourism value of some bits and the environmental value of others in a way that the kind of planning authorities may actually recognise. You can understand the value of your environmental services before we get hit with payment rates from ELMS. So there is still an opportunity to influence the payments rates of ELMS, and a lot of you through your, if you're members of the NFU or the CLA or Nature Farming, Nature Network or whoever it is, they're all lobbying. So if you've got this information, you can actually actively engage with that process. Given that you're in an area which I think is sort of bounded by quite a lot of potential development pressure, you might be interested in looking at things like how biodiversity net gain might work and what the potential value of your holding is in that. Likewise, nature recovery networks, water management. I understand you've got some interest in targeting hedge and woodland expansion, so I hope I've covered some of the aspects of that as well. And there's a number of other things that you could do, but I think those are probably the main ones. So that's me. Thank you very much. Apologies, I went a bit over, Alison. I hope you don't mark me down for that. Oh, Alison, I think you're on mute.
That's better. Can you hear me now? Yeah, yeah. That it's just, thanks, Archie. It's just it's a huge topic, isn't it? And I think the more you learn about it, it doesn't actually make the process any simpler, but it enables you to understand, what it's all about, and hopefully sort of, just to get to grips with some of the language and get some thinking about where we might want to go and what you might want to do on your own farms and estates. So thanks, Archie. So sort of over to you. I mean, has anybody sort of got any thoughts or anything that they want to sort of throw into the pot? Any questions? Might be a good time just to unmute yourselves, just so that you can participate. But it'd be good just to get, if you've got anything you want to say, it'd be good to get some discussion going.
I've got a question. Actually, thank you very much for that. That was fascinating. I come from a slightly different angle in that I'm a tenant farmer on an estate, which also farmland in hand. I'm quite interested that you as a landowner are seeing that arable farming is a risk, because obviously if that's fairly bad news as an arable farming tenant. And I'd been thinking that the way we manage the land to enhance natural capital might be, I'd seen it as a way of us managing the land to try and maintain the rental value that we're currently paying. But if correct me if I'm wrong, but you're seeing it as a way for you to recover a reduced rent if BPS goes. Is that where you're coming from?
Some and some. I mean, to say that I see arable farming as a risk is only really based on the proportion of arable incomes that are generally reliant on BPS. So, if my holding lost 25% of its income over the next 5 years, regardless of what business I was doing, if my business stood to lose that, and there was no ready way of recouping that without further investment, then that is as far as I look across my business and say, well, actually that's a risk. So therefore I'm trying to do something about it. And the approach I'm taking is that I can see that my tenants may well come under pressure because of that, and I have no desire to lose my tenants. And so therefore what I'm trying to do is generate extra income streams to the estate, which can be partnered with the tenants. They can be derived, those income streams may actually just go straight to the tenants. But as far as I'm concerned, to maintain those viable businesses and those families that have been with us for generations, I'm trying to generate extra opportunities for them so that they can support themselves. And, at the end of the day, it does also support me. But the risk that I see is that because half of my rent roll or my rent roll is so reliant on government subsidy, and everyone's is, the whole of the English farming sector is reliant on that, with the exception of high value veg growers, for example. That's not a healthy situation to be in anyway. If the government decides to change the rules, as we've seen, or become particularly belligerent about something or other, then we're all at risk. What I want to do is give my tenants and myself the opportunity to spread that risk by having a contract with Coca-Cola or having a contract with a water company, as well as the government side of things. So when I say it's a risk, I don't mean that it's necessarily, crikey, we want to get out of farming because this is, it's too fluctuating. Absolutely not the case. But what I do want to do is generate more revenue to come into the pot, so that any one part of it that drops out, we can pick up from somewhere else. So I'm basically trying to make our own land management revenue stream system in order to support everybody in the sector, rather than just pick up individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And it's possibly the best explanation. The presentation is I keep hearing about natural capital, but actually seeing somebody going through the process has been really interesting. So thank you. Just one question, Alison, about measuring number of people on footpaths. Is there an easy way of doing it? Is there a gadget that you can put on a footpath to?
Yeah, there is actually, and I know a few years back, so the Hampshire Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, we've got a great big woodland pamber forest that's right on the edge of a fairly urban area, and it was grant aided by Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council. And they said, right, if we're going to keep putting money in it, we want to know that the public are really benefiting, and we want to know how many people are actually using the woodland, because we knew that actually a lot of people were accessing it. We could see that. But we installed people counters on the gates. So every time somebody went past, it counted them. Now it does fail in that sometimes you've got somebody going out and back in again several times in the day. It will keep counting them as a new entrant. But it was a pretty good way actually of getting a handle on how many people were visiting, and we were absolutely staggered. So yeah, that is something that could be done, putting people counters on footpaths.
The other thing that we've tried with, that we're experimenting with, is 30 quid trail cams from eBay. So made trail cam, and if you're not too worried about the quality of the image that it produces, actually you can get some things that are fairly robust. They're so low quality, low value, that if somebody walks off with them, then at the end of the day, 30 quid, you can probably write it off. But that gives us some really interesting information. So we've got those dotted around the place, which we're trying to use. They are subject to issues. A deer goes past them and it'll count. But at least if you've got you can start to, what you need to find is a helpful university student, or a work experience person who's willing to go through 700 pictures of potentially counting people in them. And that's one thing I didn't say about all the work that we've done, is that I've used a huge amount of volunteer effort to get a lot of this information. And what I found is that if you offer people the opportunity to come onto private land to do whatever it is they're interested in, count birds, count people, view the beavers, whatever it might be, then actually you get quite a lot of return from that. So that's perhaps another way of doing it.
I think Stephen sort of highlighted a really good point there, which I think you answered well, Archie. Not all landowners might be the same, but I'm sort of thinking back to when single payment first came out, now BPS, and there was all the debate around who should benefit from it. Should it actually be the landowner, or should the tenant receive it? And I can see exactly the same thing happening, that the tenant farmer could be doing all of that work, improving soil structure, sequestering carbon, providing a whole range of public goods. And if it actually became a marketable commodity, the landowner might feel that they should be the ones that should benefit. Another example, I remember a few years back doing a high-level stewardship agreement for a tenant of a big estate with lots of tenant farmers, and it was quite a good, we got quite a good agreement in place, and the landlord then turned around and said, well, actually then we think we need to increase your rent because you're getting this extra income, which was just so unfair. But I think that is something that people need to be mindful of, isn't it? You know, and that needs to be established, I guess. I think perhaps tenant farmers are going to, if they know that that process is going on, need to be aware and sort of talking to the landowner from the beginning, trying to get some agreements in place as to how those benefits should be distributed.
I completely agree, and that is a conversation that's very live. I mean, I sit on the National CLA Policy and Environment Committees, and this is something that we talk about a lot. And I know that the CLA in turn are, you know, are in deep discussions with both the Tenant Farmers Association and the NGU. And I think certainly the approach I take to it is that I come at it from a kind of a long-term perspective and say, well, if the environmental condition of, I say our land, but you know, it's land that we nominally own. You know, most of our tenancies, about half the estate, is covered with, you know, multi-generational Agricultural Holdings Act tenants. So as far as I'm concerned, it's really as much their land as it is mine. Whilst I may benefit from, you know, having it on my balance sheet, they are the ones that will derive most benefit from working it day to day. And as far as I'm concerned, and this view is shared by most of the people at the CLA that I talk to, that actually it should be those people that are putting in the effort that get the reward. The issue with that obviously is potentially the length of tenancy. So if you're looking at some of these long-term agreements for things like biodiversity net gain, or, you know, soil carbon or water, you know, you might be looking at 20-30-year agreements. And I completely agree. At that point, we do have to start talking more as landlord and tenants to understand, you know, we're both benefiting from this and we should both benefit from it. It shouldn't be one or the other, because that's a wholly unsustainable position. So, you know, it's trying to work out, you know, I'm trying to offer my tenants an opportunity if I can generate it. And then I'll go back to them and have those conversations and say, listen, you know, this is your farming system now. If you changed your farming system for this, or you did something slightly differently, or we have a joint opportunity here, then, you know, how do we then carve up that? And I would say that a lot of the, I recently completed a master's at Harper Adams. It's the same master's that a lot of the land agents do. And I did that because I wanted to understand, you know, where they were coming from. And I'm not a land agent. And it was very clear to me that a lot of the land agency profession is still quite far behind on this. And the conversations they are having are perpetuating the problems between landlord and tenant, because they are just seeking to divvy up the outcomes and then leverage them, as you said, Alison. You know, you're getting more income for this, so therefore it's more valuable. But the grand scheme of things, it's quite a short-term perspective, and I don't think will really be helpful. And it does seem that the industry is slowly moving into a slightly different viewpoint on that.
Interesting.
Could I ask Archie a question? You've talked about sort of various things we can do, or a landowner consider on their farms, and you talked about trying to find a value and a market for the benefits that you're producing. Which are the areas where there is an established market, and which you know, obviously in education and things, I can see the values are going to be minuscule, but perhaps in biodiversity offsetting, and which are the established markets, and what sort of value are being achieved by people going into these things? So
in terms of the carbon market, that's probably the most active private market there is at the moment. And the Woodland Carbon Guarantee last month or last couple of months offered contracts for new woodland creation for a carbon payment on that new woodland creation, in addition to grant payments to create the woodland in the first place, of I think it was £19 per tonne. And these are, you know, 50, 60-year contracts, and you get payments at, or potentially you can claim payments at sort of 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So there is an active market there. I would say the values that are being achieved, you know, for me, looking at that on an arable setting in East Anglia, it's still hard to justify creating woodland on, you know, grade 3 arable land. But, you know, that will come. In terms of biodiversity offsetting, that's a slightly different thing to biodiversity net gain. Biodiversity net gain is the one I looked at, and there have been a few contracts done on that, but on a voluntary basis. And I think that's where the figures of anywhere between £5,000 to £20,000 per unit came from. So it depends on, you know, how much the developer needs the thing that you're providing as to how much value they ascribe to it and what your contract value can be. Water, there are some contracts being drawn up around water. So water companies, for example, are paying or asking farmers to bid for establishing cover crops in order to reduce nutrient loads in rivers. And I think I don't know what the figures of those are. I think I vaguely remember there was a few pounds per tonne of nitrate reduced, which corresponded to I can't remember, something per hectare. It was about £100 a hectare or something like that for cover cropping, but I could be wrong on that. There are other values, things like product substitution. So I know that there's water companies have paid for people to use ferric phosphate as opposed to metaldehyde, the slug pellets. And I think the one I looked into was paying, I think, £1 a tonne of ferric phosphate used, so that, you know, they cover the cost of the more expensive product. But my issue with all of those is that they are very small scale, and as a farmer, as a landowner, you don't have really enough information to understand what the value to the counterparty is. So you don't know how much you're saving the water company by keeping the nitrate in your field. You can understand that it's a benefit, and it's a benefit to wildlife, but there is somebody out there who is clearly done the calculations to say, if we stop this stuff getting into the river, then therefore we don't have to spend X. Until you understand a little bit more about what the potential X is, I don't think you're in a position to say, well, hang on a minute, you're offering me, you know, £10 a hectare. Actually, you should be offering me £600 a hectare because it's of this much value to you and your business over the period. So some of these things have much greater value, and also the values will vary depending on where you are. So, for example, outside Aberdeen, they planted a whole load of coniferous woodland, and being Scotland, it was, you know, more acceptable to do that along a major road, and that was done from an air quality perspective. And the agency that paid for that was willing to pay, you know, cost plus in order to establish that woodland because it was of benefit to them. So you've got to understand your area enough to understand who is likely to value what, and then you've got to do a bit of digging to try and understand, you know, what is that value to them. So it's very hard to say absolutely what something is worth. But also these things will change. You know, the government is about to enter this market with environmental land management. So they will pay for some of these outcomes, and they will set a rate based on something. Everyone is urging them to set a rate based on, you know, cost, income foregone plus profit, because if you can do profit, then you'll get much more take up. But whether they actually do that or not is entirely up to them.
Do you feel then that these markets will evolve? I mean, we're very much at the sort of embryonic stage of this sort of journey, and that if we are lucky enough to be alive in 20 years' time, the thing will have established much better.
I think some will. Despite our best efforts, some won't. And there are some things that really government is the only potential buyer for. So things like clean air, for example, you know, it's very hard to see how any private operation, organisation, corporate is likely to pay for clean air unless you are right next to a factory or something like that. So some of them will always sit within a government remit. Education, I slightly feel that's probably one of them, because it is incumbent upon our government to ensure that we are all educated and that we have the opportunities we need to do that. So I think unless you can strike up a private deal with a local education provider, maybe a university, maybe a private school, maybe something else, the opportunities for private contracts around education are unlikely to be high. But I wouldn't say that this is the difficulty, is that, you know, if you find an organisation who is particularly motivated for a particular reason, for example, there was a Ford plant on the edge of, I think it was in Wales, who wanted somewhere for their employees to go and walk, and so they paid for a farmer to afforest a hill, and the only reason they did that was so that they could buy a forested access, so that their employees in this factory was able to go and walk in that area. Now that's completely, you know, that is a one-off situation. So, you know, don't disregard any of them, but I think some of them will have much more kind of wider application than others.
Thank you.
It's interesting you said about valuing it to the end user, because I read somewhere that there was a negative auction for the cover cropping for one of the water companies, where farmers basically tendered for the lowest price they were prepared to grow a cover crop for, and the cheapest one, basically. And yeah, it's a worry. It's a bit of a worry, because if the likes of the NFU or the CLA could actually value these things to the end user, and we all knew what they were worth, we could start charging what they're worth. Whereas if we all just fight amongst ourselves about who can grow a cover crop the least, there's no real benefit.
No, completely. And this is why I want to understand what the value of the thing that I'm providing is, before I then go and enter a reverse auction. So it's not a negative auction, it's a reverse auction, but it's exactly as you described it. And, you know, from a water company's perspective, they're amazing, because they drive the price down, and they drive it down to a point where actually you're going to get somebody who hasn't really costed it properly, and they will underbid everyone else, and they will chew it all up, and they will bring in loads of contracts, and then suddenly they'll sit there and go, well, crikey, I didn't realise how much cover crop seed cost, or, you know, how much the operation to plant it costs, and all this kind of stuff, and they've undermined the whole market by doing that. Admittedly, they will probably only be able to do that once, because they won't get another contract, because they probably won't be able to deliver on their obligations. But reverse auctions they can be really useful if there is a parity of information between the buyer and the seller. The issue we've got at the moment is that the buyers are the ones with all the information in the water company scenario, and the sellers have virtually none in terms of the benefit. So what you're really looking for here is trying to get to a situation where you share information about the potential benefit, and you then you can then begin to kind of share the benefits of that. And that's a much more sustainable way. And to be fair, a lot of the water companies that I've spoken to, and a lot of people within them, recognize all of this. And they aren't, you know, a lot of the water companies that I've spoken to haven't taken up reverse auctions for this reason, that they don't think they're sustainable. And, you know, and some will and some won't, you know, in the same way that you'll get grain buyers who will sit there and they will hammer the price down, and, you know, they'll you know, they've got massive volumes, and they've got huge, you know, security of supply, or whatever. You know, they will sell for something or other, and some people will sell to them. There will always be that case. But if you've got a better handle on the information that you've got, so on your farm, you know, you understand that you're creating this much value, then you're in a much better position to decide whether you actually want to enter that contract or not.
Any other questions? No. Well,
if I could ask a quick one, is a much sort of lower level question. It was relating specifically back to the SciMap that you showed us. You said they did an all arable option, and then they showed how it is now, and then how it could be. But it only really included woodland. But did they also look at, you know, things like cover crops, margins, buffer strips, all that sort of stuff?
No, to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't realise they were doing this, and it was only in the final report that they pulled it out. And the guy who ran it, I think, was particularly interested in just understanding what the impact of changing in the model, you know, taking all the woodland out of our farm, do to the model. So I think he just ran it for an interest's sake, and then thought it was interesting enough to throw it into the final report. But no, they didn't do that. And I'm not sure SciMap is sensitive enough to pick up cover cropping.
No,
I think
it's showing where the potential problems are, and then it's up to you to decide what the best solutions are, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think in terms of its land use, the things that you can change within the model to change, you know, how water flows the landscape, I think it is basically, you know, arable, woodland, grassland. So, you know, in terms of crops, you probably have to say, well, actually, this then looks more like grassland than it does look like arable. So, yeah, it's a bit of a tool in that respect. But it's been a long time since I've looked into the detail of SciMap, and it's developed an awful long since then. So I could be wrong.
Yeah. Thanks, Archie.
Well, Giles and Archie, that was excellent, really interesting, and thank you so much, both of you, for giving up your evening to talk to us. I hope that everyone else, you know, got as much out of it as I did, and I think probably you did, judging by the questions that, you know, that arose. And Archie, if anybody's got any more questions or things they'd like to raise, can they contact you afterwards, or sort of let me know, and I can ask you the questions? And
yeah, well, I think everyone has your email address if they don't have mine. So if you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here. And see you all again soon.
Thanks,
you.
Alison. That's great.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Archie.